Why is change so hard? We set goals, we make promises to ourselves, we commit to new habits, and then, well, sometimes we slip back into old patterns and it can be frustrating, but it is predictable and it's fairly universal. So here's the twist. Our struggle to change isn't a personal failure, it's biology. Our brain can be wired to resist transformation, favouring the efficiency of familiarity over effort and uncertainty. Our brain can cling to these well-worn neural pathways, making new behaviours feel like we can be pushing a boulder uphill. So is lasting change even possible? Well, the answer is yes, reassuringly, but only if we work with our brains rather than against it. So today we're diving into the science of transformation, from neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself, and why loss aversion keeps us stuck. So we're going to uncover what could be holding us back from change, and most importantly, how to design our environment, reframe our mind frames, and use behavioural science to make change effortless.
Gosh, Amy, I know change. It is hard. Why do we resist it so much? Tell us.
Well, it is such a good question, and it's a really common question. Why do we resist change? What happens in the brain when we actually are trying to change? How can we design change to be easier and more longer lasting? And it's a huge part of the work that we do with organisations. Almost everything involves some sort of change. But the sad stats show that only about 30% of change initiatives are considered clear successes, from Gartner research. And if you take a different view, you look at New Year resolutions, the stats are around 92% of people do not achieve or sustain their New Year's resolutions. And I don't know about you or your experience with patients or yourself, but is your experience that change is easy and straightforward?
Oh gosh, no. I mean, this podcast is going to be very enlightening, I'm sure, but no, change is hard. I mean, on a personal level, I stopped making New Year's resolutions a long time ago because I realized that they were unrealistic in achieving them, and then it just made me feel bad. And January, in my working life, January is a time where patients come to me and I hear about their good intentions and their desire to change. But as is often the case, motivation gradually dwindles as the days go on. And I think it is because we do set such high expectations of ourselves. And, classically, weight loss and reduction in things like HbA1c, which is our marker of our overall sugar control, and cholesterol levels, and trying to kind of lower those numbers. It doesn't happen overnight. Physiologically, it would be impossible to make those changes in such a short space of time, yet we are trying to set ourselves these highly unachievable and unrealistic goals, which then ultimately lead to disappointment and us feeling like failures. So yes, change is very prominent at the beginning of the year. But I have definitely stopped making New Year's resolutions, Amy, because I just know that I won't keep them.
No, and there was a couple of things you said in there, well, several things that are really pivotal, and we could spend hours talking about just the individual topic areas. So you said about when our motivation dwindles. Our motivation does ebb and flow, and for a huge variety of reasons, biological reasons being one set of those, which is why if we're looking to create long-lasting sustainable change, we need to harness more than just the power of our motivation. We want to use behavioural science, use nudges, our environment to help influence the change. You also said that sometimes our expectations can be way too high, and I think that's really key to be aware of. And I know a lot of coaches that we've supported have tuned into seeing the impact of realistic expectations, because we've got to build people's identities to be healthy and helpful identities. And it's the same with patients as it is with colleagues in this regard, that we want to view ourselves in a positive light, which part of what we need to do for that is to reinforce the identity that you can do the things that you put your mind to. But obviously, if you've set yourself up with these unrealistic expectations, then that's not going to be so helpful. A friend of mine recently climbed Snowdon, And I was really envious. One, because the photos looked amazing at the top of this big hill mountain in Wales, and two, because of the sense of personal accomplishment. I imagine it feels pretty good to be at the top of a mountain. And I thought, well, maybe I can. Maybe I can climb Snowdon. And I said to my husband, did you, obviously I'd need to make some changes. I'd need to probably do a bit more training, a bit more walking to be able to do more than probably the hour that I comfortably can at the moment. And I said, do you think I can? To my husband, he said, no. No, that's a silly idea. You cannot climb Snowdon. And obviously, you could take that from two angles, couldn't you? You could go, oh, what does he know? He's not looking big enough and not being bold enough. Or you could go, well, actually, maybe he's got some insight into current situation. And it's not beyond you in time. And we had a longer conversation, which that transpired. But right now, it's probably beyond me. So if I were to set out on that expedition, it would probably be unrealistic. And I think that also parallels with what you were saying in terms of the quick changes. We wouldn't expect, our glucose responsiveness to change, our weight to change overnight, any of those things. And it's the same with our brain, which is where the change is happening. It's not going to change overnight, but we can start taking the positive steps, but we then need to be able to sustain them.
Absolutely.
So
I'll add hiking boots to your Christmas wish list then, Amy, shall I?
yeah, yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's out there. I'd like to. I do hear a lot of people, especially these days, talk about how hard change is. And I often feel really mixed when we phrase change in these ways, because although, yes, there is this resistance and there's neuroscience around why it can be difficult to change, there's the flip side of it too, in that our brains do change all the time, don't they? At the very smallest level, we see physiological changes even at the synaptic bulb in terms of how the neurotransmitters are released and how they're taken back up into the synaptic bulb. And all of those structural changes are happening, they are real. So it's definitely not the case that we can't change. It just might mean that we need to work out how to work with our brains to do that. The brain loves efficiency. Our basal ganglia is dedicated to wiring in these habits so that we can work on autopilot a lot of the time. And we used to sometimes talk about Homer Simpson, about how he personifies our influenceability, which probably isn't a word, by the physical environment. He sees a donut, he eats a donut. And what we can take from that is, okay, well, how can we remove the seeing of the donut? If that's the problem for him and Marge's voice isn't loud enough telling him to step away from the donut, Homer, then it links to why the advice is often clear out the foods that you don't want to eat from your home, because we're less likely to eat them in that way. But I mean, do you ever see that sort of resistance to change manifest in any of your work, that sort of challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my role as a GP trainer is to facilitate the education of doctors who are fully trained, but who are now specializing in general practice. And in order to get to that point in time, they would have had to have done numerous hospital specialties and, switched from job to job, often every 4 months, switching different specialties. And then when they come into general practice for their kind of apprenticeship year, it's their final year in general practice, I often see initially it's quite difficult for them to adopt the change in mindset that's required for general practice. In GP land, we are very limited with the number of tests and investigations at our fingertips, at our disposal. So we're relying heavily on our clinical acumen and, pure clinical examination skills. And I think sometimes GP trainees who are coming from hospital jobs find it hard to make that change. I mean, I can recall one trainee in particular, very diligent, very hardworking trainee, and they'd just finished a very busy medical hospital post, and they'd come into the general practice domain. And when you first start off as a trainee, the number of patients you see is very small compared to a fully qualified GP. And this particular trainee was very diligent and thought it would be very helpful to, as well as examining and taking a history from the patient, to then also do the blood test at the same time. And yes, that is very helpful and very efficient. But when you're on the numbers of patients that you're going to be on by the end of your training, there just isn't time to do blood tests as well. And so it's just not a realistic expectation to be doing all of the investigations yourself. So that is something that I quite often see when they first start, and very quickly, even though they have more time at the beginning with each patient, I try to remind them of their role at that moment in time. They're an investigator. They will need to do tests, but they're not immediate things. And if it is something that's immediate and more acute, then of course that needs to go to secondary care and our hospital colleagues. But it's making that that kind of switch in mindset, which can be quite tricky for them to begin with.
Yeah, and knowing that it's an important shift to make, but reinforcing that until they then really see it and experience it could be a hard transition, I imagine, for them to go through. One of the reasons, I guess, why it's beneficial to have those around you with different experiences that can then prompt you.
Yeah. And it does feel awkward and uncomfortable to not be able to give people an answer straight away, because in the hospital setting, you see a patient, you do a blood test, an hour later you get the results. We don't have that necessarily, obviously, in general practice, and it can feel really unnerving for them to have to say to a patient, do you know what, I don't actually know what's going on, but this is my hypothesis, this is what I'm thinking, this is my differential list of diagnoses. But I think when we come from a place of seeing a patient, getting tests and having answers in a very short space of time in a hospital setting, to then general practice where there's a lot of uncertainty, that is the thing that they often struggle with the most. It's the uncertainty and the not knowing. And yes, that's uncomfortable, but they have to start to become comfortable with that in order to then proceed in their training.
Yeah, and I see the theme of uncertainty derail a lot of people in a lot of different ways. And there's some research that's summarized in a lovely phrase called "losses loom larger than gains." The psychology of loss aversion, Kahneman, Tversky did a lot around this, and I think people have experienced that often. We don't like the idea of letting something go, of losing something, even when we know we might be gaining something new. But that loss has risk and uncertainty attached to it, and the loss of the familiar sometimes even. And you see in organisations, employees resisting new systems, new approaches, not adopting things at the speed that their colleagues would often prefer that they did. And partly that's because of the way that the brain is processing it. And I was working with an organisation just this morning, and one of the key takeaways that I wanted them to have was remembering that how they frame things has a huge impact on what people are then able to do. And if we can make the future feel tangible, if we can paint a picture, if they can see the benefits, then that will be activating the reward system in their brain and make the anticipation and then the dopamine and the then drive to take those steps, make those changes, will follow. And without that, if we can't see that picture, I think we've spoken about this before, but it just becomes much more difficult to take those steps. Is that something that you see or utilize ever?
Yeah, you're right, Amy. The reframe is really important. I mean, we kind of try to emphasize this in coaching, but yes, in my line of work, I see it all the time, and I try to encourage patients to sometimes look at the situation from a different perspective, or to reframe the situation. One example being when I've had patients who are trying to reduce an unhealthy trait, such as their alcohol consumption. One patient in particular quite openly and honestly admitted that the alcohol consumption was their form of stress relief. After a busy, hard day at work, they would unwind with a glass of wine, but gradually that kind of volume and frequency of alcohol consumption was increasing. And, you know, they were horrified at the thought of, you know, having to take away their crutch and their stress relief, but to then reframe that by highlighting the health benefits, which is obviously my agenda, ultimately, but then acknowledging for her, the motivation for her would be obviously the health benefits, but also the financial gains of reducing the alcohol consumption, and trying to get the individual to see it from a different perspective is obviously very important. It's the same scenario, but just viewed in a different way.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think it links to the impact of how we see ourselves. Our identity is hugely influential, and we see it a lot in work with individuals, but then even with teams. If the team identity, if you're connecting people to who you are, how you do things, and then if you're positioning a gap between, oh, but we see ourselves like this is who we are. For example, we're innovative, we're cutting edge, we're a good place to work, and then you identify something that doesn't quite fit with that, that's easier for people to want to then make the change. We're talking about the medial prefrontal cortex if we're interested in terms of the self identity type behaviors. But if we are, so for us as individuals and for us as leaders in organizations, being aware of healthy identities and then positioning undesirable behaviors as in conflict with that could create the cognitive dissonance in an empowering way. So, for example, if someone starts by being, I'm a relaxed individual, I work hard and therefore I deserve to relax at the end of the day. In their mind, that might be the identity that they're holding. But if you say, well, yes, you only use alcohol in a healthy, safe way to relax, but somewhere along the line, you've now fallen into the category of alcoholic. And they think, goodness, no, I definitely don't want to be that identity. That is not who I believe I am. And you go, great. So you just need to drop those behaviors and then you can move forward. And I, in a very, very small way, I did a sort of similar experiment with myself recently. I used to believe I had really strong willpower. And as probably my cognitive bandwidth has shrunk a little over the years, I'd started to believe that I didn't have good willpower anymore, and I was drinking Diet Pepsi more often than I would feel proud to admit. I've struggled with this on and off throughout my life. I remember times visiting your mum and dad's house, and your dad would always have, the Diet Coke or the Diet Pepsi in for me, and I'd be like, oh, thank you so much. I was trying to quit. Thank you so much. But recently I listened to some stuff and I was like, oh, why am I doing this? I don't want to be someone who consumes this volume of this particular thing, personal choice. And so I just made the decision. And that just decision to stop because it was in conflict with who I believed I was, then really reinforced a positive thing. So, I mean, it's something really trivial, really small in the grand scheme of things. But now I feel reinvigorated. Like, I am someone with good willpower. If I decide to do something, then I will do it. So there's knock-on benefits sometimes, aren't there?
There are. I mean, I have to say, I mean, we talk a lot about these kind of identity pieces at various points in the podcast series, but I was a bit of a cynic when it came to this because I've never been a morning person. I've said we've been to university together. You'd have to wake me up for lectures, and then when my son was born, he didn't sleep very well. So my little sleep thief confirmed this identity of me not being a morning person. However, after listening to you speak about this several times over the years, I've had to reframe this new schedule in my life that was thrown at me from when he was a poor sleeper as a child to then going through single parenthood. I've just realized that I am a morning person. This is just my new schedule because I am still coping and I'm still managing to thrive, and my child is still alive and well. So yeah, so I am a morning person. I don't enjoy being a morning person, but I am one. But it is about then coming back to reframing again, isn't it? But yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, that behavioural flexibility, I think, is so important because being someone who chooses when you can, when it makes sense, to be up later and up later in the morning, that's fine when it works for you. But if you needed to be getting your son up to school, you to work by certain times, then you almost need to be flexible enough to do those other behaviours as well. And that's where then being too fixed can be challenging, and we see that being a problem for some people. And I guess a link to that also is when we have the intention to do something, but we don't always follow through. And there's a knowledge to action gap, there's an intention to action gap, there's lots of gaps that cognitively we could picture something and we could set a goal, and our prefrontal cortex could be totally on board with something. But deeper regions within the brain, the limbic network, the amygdala, other regions, might be conditioned differently and might be prioritizing more of the instant gratification. So the temptation to stay in bed rather than leap up and jump into things could be difficult. So, and I do see this with my daughter sometimes. Her intention might be to study a particular topic, even if she doesn't enjoy the studying itself. And the intentions are great right up until it actually comes time that she's decided she's going to do it. And then it's like, oh, I really don't want to do it. And that's where then, I think as parents, we bring out all of our coaching tools to try and reconnect to both the cognitive intention, but also then activate the more emotional drivers, and ideally activate the dopamine linked to the process of doing it rather than just the end result. Although if you can only go with the end result, that could be enough to pull you through with the behaviour. It's hard, isn't it?
It is hard. And I think you've spoken about this before when we've had conversations, but trying not to focus purely on the end result is often quite important. So kind of breaking it up into bite-sized chunks and having small steps to focus on, rather than, I need to have achieved this by the end of this time of the day. So that can definitely help overcome this challenge, I think.
I see that a lot. And it's absolutely the case that the ideal would be to break it down and to try and positively connect with each of the individual steps. But the real world, I was working with a group of behavioural science students the other day. Some were doing PhDs in the topic, and some had done like their masters and then been out into industry and then had come back to PhD. And they were asking me lots of questions about our work with organisations, because they said, do you know what we've learned, Amy? The real world is a lot harder than the theoretical world. They said in the books it all makes sense, and in the papers it makes sense because we've taken and we've isolated one specific thing, and then we've worked with that, and we can get it to work, in the lab almost. But in the organisations and with the complex humans, when you're trying to change lots and it's all complex, and I say, yeah, I know it gets a bit sticky out there, doesn't it? But it's it's brilliant that we have the people doing that research, because we can draw so much from that. I think you just then need that, I don't know, to bear in mind that, and I'm always telling organisations, look, the problems that you are working on at the moment are complex problems. So if we're trying to design change that sticks, we have to work with human nature and understand, but we can't isolate it. We're not lab rats where we can just isolate one component. We have to look at the environment that people are existing within and work out how we're going to do that, how we're going to make the desired behaviours automatic, how we're going to use habit stacking where possible, how we're going to remove friction. A lot of our work at the moment is about removing the friction points, and how we're going to then build up the social stories, the positive narratives, the social proof. There's so much behavioural science that can help shape, but as I was saying to one company the other day, you can't just isolate just do these two things. If there's 7 influences on this outcome that you're trying to create, if you just address these two things, these other five are going to scurry onto the scene and scupper your good efforts. And I think that can be difficult.
And I think the other thing is obviously in organizations, in my line of work, we're all there to, we have a similar mindset. Yes, we're all very different individually, but we're all kind of working towards the same goal. And I definitely know that on the days that I work with different colleagues, but there's one colleague in particular on one of my days, they are the way they structure their day definitely influences how I then structure my day. I mean, they come in a bit earlier than I do. They clear all their blood results at the beginning of the day rather than a little bit later on in the day. And it does kind of, in a way, drive my motivation to behave in a certain way as well.
Yeah. Yeah, they've changed your context. It's not the same environment that you're walking into, and that has an influence. And if we can intentionally design these kind of environments that are going to help us to then be at our best, obviously we can't control other people, but we can be aware of when others are making what we're trying to do easier or more difficult. And I love the fact that I'm hearing more and more awareness around how our environment is influencing us. Obviously, I write about it a lot in Make Your Brain Work, but a group of leaders I was with recently, I was talking to them about something quite different, but there was just one question towards the end of our virtual session together, which like the answer, the input I wanted to share with them was about how we are so bombarded by different information streams these days, and how that does make a lot of people's jobs more difficult. You experience interruptions at work. It's part of the course to a degree, but also you can redesign how people work with you so that you do get a little bit of protected thinking time, because we need your brains to be really sharp when you're doing the work that you do. But looking at, do we want to be on Teams available all day, every day? Or do we need some time where we're not going to be interrupted by phone calls, emails, messages popping up to protect our thinking and go deeper? Because a train of thought is just that. It does need time sometimes to go on the journey. It's not like just quick flashes of insight. Often even to get that insight, we need a little bit more time. So
Yeah.
there's lots of things that all seem to be working together, but hopefully we're moving towards a place again where people have got more awareness and then can construct these experiences of change more positively.
Oh, that sounds good, Amy. And I don't know if we have time for you to delve in a little bit more for us about neuroplasticity, which you mentioned in your introduction. So
Yeah.
we have a general understanding, I have a general understanding of what that means and how it works, but why is it so important?
So it's a normal, natural way that our brain works. I often say in the olden days, we used to think that the brains were only plastic up till about the age of 21, but we know that the brain remains plastic. And actually, a group I was with the other day were French, and so I could tell them about the French nun study. Well, I tell lots of people, but it was especially relevant for them, where these group of nuns they were living to well over 100, but they weren't experiencing any signs of dementia, which was quite surprising for this larger population living a long time. Kindly, they left their brains to medical science so they could be investigated after they died. And what they found was actually there were plaques present. There were some of the anatomical signs of aging that we would expect, but we would expect them to have symptoms correlating with memory problems and all of those things that we see. And they didn't have any of those. And the researchers hypothesized that because part of being a nun was that idleness is a sin, and that they were to keep in close community, they would keep active, they would keep learning things, they would keep contributing to their community. They believed they had extra synaptic density, so they had spare, so that when they lost some of their synaptic connections, they had enough that then they weren't experiencing symptoms. So not only is neuroplasticity essential for us to learn, develop, grow, contribute, change, but it also seems like we are designed to benefit from it and to keep investing in it. Now, that's not to say that we can eradicate the situations where some people do get these dementias, and it's not anyone's fault when these things happen. We know that there's always a combination of genetics and environment that lead to these situations.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we recognise that. It's the same with mental health, same with everything. But we've come from a time where there's been more blame associated with mental health conditions,
Mm.
but this sort of combination and this opportunity to then go, okay, so I can use my plastic brain, my neuroplasticity, to help me learn, develop, create new habits, break more challenging habits, replace them with healthy ones, build resilience, support my mental health, even recover from brain injuries. I remember years ago, there was a case of a medical student who had just been partaking in normal research, who had not had any adverse experiences in their life, didn't know that they were differently wired, as it were, to the average person. But they were missing most of one of their hemispheres when they'd partaken in this research. And it's just shocking to think how plastic the brain can be. And some of the research today is astounding in terms of being able to see without necessarily having a functional optic nerve, being able to hear. It just, our brains really are so incredible. We can train ourselves to be more adaptable. Yes, there are things that can make that more challenging, but there are also things that can make it much more interesting. Oh, we could talk about this all day, but if you have, go on.
No, I was just saying it's all very exciting. The fact that we can train our brain to be more adaptable and to strengthen this neuroplasticity, that's really exciting.
It is. It is not just for our kids, but for us and for parents, and yeah, at every stage of life. Well, if this has inspired you, knowing that the change conundrum brings hope and options and opportunities, then please share this episode with a friend or colleague who might find it helpful, because it helps us to reach more people like you.
So make sure you're following us on your preferred viewing or listening platform so you're the first to know when new episodes drop.